Hey everybody, hello Toronto, excited to be here. My name is Lance Weiler, and over the next 45 minutes I'm going to just talk about this topic of kind of story-driven innovation, this idea of how you can use kind of mixed story and code. I'm going to talk about building immersive experiences and experience design in general, and I'm going to highlight a couple of the things that we're working on at the Columbia University Digital Storytelling Lab. But just before I start, I was wondering how many people in the room are designers? Okay. And how many people in the room are storytellers? Designers and storytellers can be the same thing. Okay, cool. All right, so a little origin story about myself. I've been writing and directing, designing, producing, wearing many hats for the last 20-some years, working a lot in film and television, and also designing like global games and doing all kinds of art installations and things along those lines. And I want to just give a little story about where it kind of broke wide open for me, or I guess was kind of almost like an epiphany for me that kind of set me on a course of really thinking about this idea of how story could drive innovation. If you could kind of imagine a time when there weren't necessarily cell phones and the commercial internet was just a few years in, and at the time I was working as a camera operator, camera assistant, and I was working a lot of commercials all over the world, and I was sitting in Penn Station, and I was flipping through a magazine, and I saw this ad for a card, an ISA card, that I could put into a computer that would allow me to edit. It sounds kind of novel now, considering that you can edit on a phone, but at the time it was a really big deal. And I thought, wow, that's a good reason to have a computer. And the year was 1996. And so a colleague of mine, a friend, Stefan Avalos and myself, we sat down and we said, well, now that we have this card and we can build our own computers and we can edit, why don't we see if we can make a movie for no money? You know, let's see if we can make it for nothing. And at the time, I had failed miserably to raise about $250,000 to make a science fiction film shooting on Super 16, which is a film format. And then Stefan had been ripped off internationally with a movie that he had made by a foreign sales agent. And so we were feeling like we really wanted to kind of buck this idea of permission-based culture and see if we could make this movie for no money. And so, we set out to do that, had our family and friends involved in it. When we totaled up all the receipts, it was like $900, right, to make this movie. It took 86 days to render it, which is a long time. And at that point, we decided that we had made it for so little, it didn't make any sense to transfer it to film to take it to a film festival because the costs were like $30,000 to $60,000. Didn't make any sense at all. So around that time, there was a new emergent technology. It's probably in the projector that's being used here today. It was called digital light processing. It was by Texas Instruments. And I had read that they were releasing it to a number of OEMs like Sony and Barco and NEC and all these different competitors. And so I thought, well, I'm going to reach out to them. We have this movie that was all digital, it's kind of like cinema of the future, and let's make use of these projectors. And so I reached out to them, and I sent a letter, it was a very long time ago, and nobody responded, it was like crickets. And meanwhile, the computer's chugging along, processing this movie, and we're getting close to the time that we're going to actually have to show it. And so I sit down and I think, okay, well, you know what? I got an idea. And I misaddressed all the letters and sent them again. So I sent Sony a letter that said Barco on it, and I sent Barco a letter that said Sony on it, and I sent them all out, and all of a sudden all of them called, right? And at the time we were only trying to get a projector for like 3 days, which was a rental I think of like $10,000. They ended up giving us a projector anywhere in the world that we wanted for free for 2.5 years. And so we ended up introducing digital projection to, Sundance and Cannes and all these different places with this idea of democratizing what it was to tell stories, And at the time we were totally ostracized by our fellow filmmakers, because we weren't shooting on film, we represented what was this bastardization of the form, I guess, in some ways to them. It's funny now because most things are digitally projected at festivals and in many film, in many theaters as well. And so it was interesting because that project, we just kept, I think there was this naive quality. We thought anything was possible with it because we made it for so little. And then what we ended up doing was we thought, okay, well, how do we scale this now that we've shown it in a theater? And I thought, Stefan and I thought, why don't we do it via satellite? And we didn't know anything about satellite, so I faked extension numbers between L'Oreal and Boeing and talked my way up to the top of those companies and then had them pitted against each other. And then we walked away with like $2.5 million to R&D, what became digital cinema. Then we received a number of studio offers for that film, that little $900 film. We turned it down, and we self-distributed that movie all over the world to over 20 countries around the world, and to date, it's grossed over $5 million. So the reason I tell that story is because it was a moment where I realized that the story wasn't just what we were writing for a script, the actors were saying that was on screen. It was the story of the whole experience. It was this idea of being creative across all of it, not just the art and craft of the filmmaking itself, but also the entrepreneurial spirit that was behind it, and this idea to innovate new solutions when the solutions don't exist. And so I've been at Columbia University now for about, I'd say, 5 years, almost 5 years. And at Columbia, I wear a number of different hats. I teach in the School of the Arts. I teach a course called Building Story Worlds, the Art, Craft, and Business of Storytelling in 21st Century. And then I also have an appointment where I am the Director of Experiential Learning and Applied Creativity, and I'm tasked with R&Ding the future of the university, kind of almost like building a university inside the university. In addition, I am the director of the Digital Storytelling Lab, and I wanted to share with you some findings of what we've had in terms of this idea of exploring and building immersive worlds. So at the Digital Storytelling Lab, we really look at this idea of, what are new forms and functions of storytelling? How can it be used, and what can we do with it? Outside of entertaining people or making social impact or action, what are some interesting things that we can do with it in terms of exploring what story means in terms of the 21st century? So we kicked off a prototype about a year ago, which was called Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. And it's kind of almost like, it's kind of like peanut butter and chocolate, right? This idea of Sherlock Holmes and this idea of IoT. And at the core was this Arthur Conan Doyle. And what was interesting, I had been reading that now Arthur Conan Doyle's work is all in the global public domain. So you can take it and you can make use of it and you can do all kinds of things with the original body of his work. And I thought that that was interesting. And then this idea of a new emergent category like IoT, the Internet of Things, I thought, what if we combine those two things? Because what was fascinating about Arthur Conan Doyle's work is that when he was writing his serialization, writing his short stories, his 4 novels, he was writing about new emergent technologies that nobody knew about outside of certain small circles. So he was writing about non-contaminated crime scenes, he was writing about ballistics, he was writing about different types of blood tests. And at the time, law enforcement was reading that and saying, wow, these are really good ideas, we should actually adopt these. And then the general public was reading it because at that time, when he was writing, there was no Scotland Yard, there were no crime labs. They were saying, why don't we have a crime lab? And so in a lot of ways, what Arthur Conan Doyle was doing, his fiction was starting to influence fact, and that was, to this project, was really fascinating. This idea of not only could we examine shifts in authorship and ownership of stories, but also what new emergent opportunities could come from looking at these technologies through a detective narrative, And so we combine those two things. And I love this quote by Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think the Internet of Things is very much like that. For most people who don't know what the Internet of Things is, it's this idea that in short order, all these common objects within our lives will be connected to networks. So currently there's like 1.5 trillion sensors in the world. There's sensors in our cars, in our homes, in our places of work, and they're all connected to networks. So there's a lot of data that's moving back and forth, and there's a lot of very interesting kind of ethical and political issues that are kind of entrenched in all of that. At the same time, what we wanted to do with this project is we wanted to experiment with this idea of copyleft. We made the whole Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things all about this idea that you could take it and you could participate, and it's open to whoever wants to be a part of it. We have tons of people all over the world who are participating. It's released under a Creative Commons license, share-alike license, and you can commercialize what you do within it as long as you give back the code base and you share what your experiences are with it. So this idea of doing something with copyleft, this idea of taking this original source material from Arthur Conan Doyle and using it as this fertile playground to start to experiment with what we could do as a large, massive, global storytelling experiment. So the way that it works and has worked over the last over a year or so is it starts when people will go to the source material and they'll find an object from one of Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, and they'll take that object and then they'll make an adaptation with it using physical computing, sensors, and they'll create like this enchanted object that's intended to be something that they can use as a way to tell a story with. And I'll explain in detail what I mean by that. But what was interesting about the way that we approached this project is that we knew that we were going to do something with IoT, but we didn't start that way. Instead, we started for about 6 months through a series of meetups. We did everything in physical form, paper testing, and kind of just playing with this idea of developing a very simple analog prototype. The analog prototype consisted of 4 key areas, and I'm going to describe how it worked, because I think what was really fascinating about it was we kind of started to realize that it was something that was not only fueling a collaborative story between these participants, but it was actually aiding and exploring this idea of what it's like to work in the 21st century as dispersed teams across silos, diverse backgrounds, perspectives, so forth and so on. And so the prototype kind of worked like this. It would take about 90 minutes or less to run it, and we would break people into teams of anywhere from 5 to 6 participants. We found that that was the best. When we had less than 5, certain personalities would dominate and people would have a miserable time. And then when it was too large, it started to become this almost like a consensus vortex where nothing ever really happened. Everybody couldn't really decide together to move things forward. And so that idea of 5 or 6 people was really solid. So we would go and we'd say, okay, we'd break them into teams, and then we'd hand them a roll of masking tape. And we'd say, okay, now go out and create a crime scene with your fellow teammates. And so they go off and they get super clever, and they start taping out bodies, and they think, okay, somebody's going to come and they're going to have to solve this. So they get really clever about what they were doing. And then they come back, and we would lay down brown paper, and we would tell them to empty their pockets and their bags and to find 3 things that they thought were really interesting to tell a story with. And then they would just trace those things. So if they had, sunglasses or their phone or whatever it was, they would trace the outline of it. And they'd do that as an individual. And then we'd say to them, okay, now step back and pick 3 things that aren't yours, rip them out, cut them out, and now you have them. So you have 3 objects, these outlines of these objects. And then we'd say, as an individual, go back to any of the bodies except your team's body, and you can place these objects. But when you place them with purpose. Where you put that phone, where you put those glasses, put them in relation to the body and be creative with it. So then they would come back and we'd say, okay, now it's time for us to create some clues. And this was almost like a flash fiction phase, if anybody's ever is familiar with that that famous phrase by Ernest Hemingway, for sale, baby shoes never worn. Very evocative statement, this idea of flash fiction. And so we'd say, look, here's a packet of Post-it notes and some pens. You can go around, if you see that phone on the ground, you can write last voicemail message from crying ex-girlfriend. You can put it down next to the phone. If you see the glasses, you can say teeth marks on stem, broken lenses. And you can put that down. And you can put down as many as you want, but you do it as an individual. And all of a sudden, and the only rule is you can't do it at your own crime scene, your own body, your team's body. So then people would put it down, it would populate, and it would be all these crazy clues and these objects and these bodies taped out. And then they'd come back and we'd say, okay, now you're a team again. And now you're going to go back to your original body, but you're going to realize there are all kinds of clues there, and there's all kinds of objects there that you've never seen. And that crime scene that you created in the beginning, you're actually going to solve it, So then they would go back and they'd be a collaborative Sherlock Holmes, and they didn't have to use everything that was there. They picked and chose what they wanted to, but then they crafted these narratives and these stories that were incredibly dynamic, and they did it very quickly, and then they would share it with everybody else who was participating. So what was fascinating about that was people started to, as we kind of evolved that forward, people started to create objects that were based on different Sherlock Holmes stories. This is a voodoo monkey. And the voodoo monkey, when you actually take pins and stab it into the monkey, its eyes are LEDs, and it will light up with like Morse code based upon the placement of the pins and what you're doing. You can also move the monkey around, and it's aware of its surroundings, and will interact with other objects. So it'll feel like as though it's like this enchanted thing. It's interesting, too, because I didn't mention it at the top, but one of the other things that was really kind of serendipitous, I guess, or something, in terms of Arthur Conan Doyle, was that he was way into clairvoyance. He was way into this idea of talking to the afterlife, talking to the dead. And so this idea that we would have these objects that could kind of communicate in and around these crime scenes started to take on a whole different meaning. But this was one that was actually from Italy. So what we did was we worked everything towards a global challenge. So in the fall of last year, Lincoln Center had said to me, do you want to do something with us? We can give you Lincoln Center. We can give you the campus of Lincoln Center. And it was like, okay, that's great. That's like 13 acres in the middle of Manhattan. Sure. But we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do with it, right? And so we worked together through a series of meetups and then with a global community, which has, I guess, at the time and now, it's probably close to 2,000 collaborators from 60 different countries. Last year, there were 70 self-organized events all over the world. There's been a ton already this year. And Lincoln Center was like this really interesting opportunity to kind of put on a show, but we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do. So they gave us the space. And so these are some shots from when we were there. And it's funny because we had this constraint where Lincoln Center said, you can't use any tape, but we'll give you actors. And we're like, wait, we can't use a roll of tape? It's like $2.50, but you're going to have actors who are going to be standing around, laying around all day? Yep. And it's like, okay, cool, we'll have actors then. So that one constraint was really interesting because we went back and forth and we thought, okay, well, let's put them in, like dress them in period or something, And then the further we went, the more we realized, well, how do we embody it so it's like that idea of what happens during the prototype. When people go and they see an outline of a body, they don't know what the body looks like. And so the body can be anything to anybody. It's like when you're reading a good novel, right? Like the way you imagine the character versus somebody else could be very different. And so there was this amazing moment every time that we would get to the end. So what ended up happening with the bodies was they would come out, they would rise up from up above and kind of wander down and then kind of stand there, and they would start the whole process. And then they would be moved and manipulated by the teams and put into a position of what the crime was. And then they would lay there and they would wait. and then everybody would kind of rotate through, similar to what I talked about with the prototype, but we would have exchanges where they were populating the crime scenes and all the bodies were laying around and everything that I just mentioned previously. But what was cool at the end was that the bodies actually reenacted the crimes, so they went from like acting to then laying in the position of the tape, where the tape would have been, the final position, resting place of the body. But the moment that was interesting was every time that they would unveil themselves, there was an audible gasp every time from the audience, because they couldn't believe that they looked the way that they looked, or they thought that they saw it a different way, but every single time they audibly gasped in terms of the response. We had an object, which I'll show you in a bit, that was a rotary phone that you could move around the crime scene with, and it would interact, and I'll break that down. But before I get there, I thought that this was interesting. This is Daniel is a famous Sherlock Holmes historian, and he had seen what we were doing, and he said, your playfulness and experimentation of narrative forms would make Conan Doyle proud. He would have loved this. So that was actually pretty cool. We were excited about that. But there were 4 kind of design principles that emerged from this prototype, and this was culturally relevant. We tested this thing all over the world. The first was this idea of a trace, right? Like the trace was basically, we noticed that people really responded well when they could see some element of themselves within the story, And what's interesting is when we first started this, the very first prototypes that we did of it, we thought, we'll write the stories, we'll populate the crime scenes, we'll lay out the bodies, and then people come in and they'll be Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and they'll love it. But what was actually more engaging was when they were creating everything, and we were kind of stepping back and saying, okay, we're just going to let it happen. So that one step of the trace was really important, where they could see a contribution of themselves within the story. The second was this idea of granting agency. Because we broke it up from a group task to an individual task and back and forth, that led to these moments that allowed people to feel like they actually had an impact over what was going on. They didn't feel like they were just following somebody else who might be a dominant personality that was leading them within a team, and that was interesting. The third was this idea of a thematic frame. Most people probably know Sherlock Holmes. If they don't, they know what a detective narrative is or a mystery, and if they see a body on the ground, they probably know there was a crime. So there was a common language there that really helped quite a bit. And then the last was this idea of social movement, serendipity management almost. This idea that a lot of times interactive work is so much about the tell and so little about the show, right? It's like that's a classic screenwriting thing, right? You're supposed to show, don't tell. Interactive work a lot of times gets very concerned that people won't know how to interact with it in the proper way, and so it ends up telling too much. We left a lot of gaps in this experience, and because we left those gaps, the imaginations of the participants filled them, but then they also led to these really wonderful kind of moments where they would collide into each other in unexpected ways, and these collaborative sparks, creative sparks would kind of pop up out of it, which was really exciting. When we were going through and trying to figure out how to deal with, trying to manage, the creative process of thousands of people, we ended up running... We ran an open MOOC, massive, we called it a massive online-offline collaboration. They're usually known as a massive open online course. We're going to be running it again, and it's open to whoever wants to participate. The pilot that we ran had about 300 people in it. In addition to that, we made use, this is HackPad, which I guess maybe about a year and a half ago was acquired by Dropbox, but then they open sourced the code for it. It's just like a collaborative document meets wiki. So we had a lot of people who were in there kind of doing all their work within that space and kind of collaborating in that form. And It was very wild, but it was also super easy. And if you're interested, it's Sherlock.hackpad.com, and there's tons of stuff there. And it's all about like all the different times we prototyped, all the things that worked and didn't work. People just sharing process openly. There's links out to, if anybody's into GitHub or into any code, there's all kinds of links off of this to code bases, because one of the jobs of the project is to try to create an open library for storytelling with IoT, is one of the goals. But I think the other thing that made this work in terms of the HackPad part was just the ease of use and the fact that they could see each other typing in it, And so it was interesting how something so simple was so effective in terms of them being able to organize themselves. And then, a lot of the project is very much about this idea of story culture meeting maker culture, and kind of creating the physicality of stories. What does it mean when a story is no longer just on a screen? And what does it mean when, through the democratization, the rapid commoditization of the technology that we have, what does it mean when those formerly known as the audience become collaborators? They become their own storytellers. My son is 8 years old. He's way into Minecraft. And he came to me last year and he said, "Hey, Dad, what's screen capture software?" And I said, "Why do you want to know?" He's like, "Stampy Cat uses it." I'm like, "Stampy who?" He's like, "Stampy Cat, let me show you." And so he brings me over. Does anybody know Stampy Cat in the room? Okay, a couple people. Well, the 3 people that raised their hands and about 293 million other people per month know Stampy Cat. And they happen to be in the age group of my son, right? So Stampy Cat, what he does is he plays Minecraft, and he creates characters, and he just makes Let's Play videos, right? He pulls like 7 figures a year just through partnership program stuff. So, but my son got really into it, and he started making his own stories, right? He's made almost 20 of them, I guess, now, and they range anywhere from 5 minutes to like 20 minutes, and they have a structure to them, right? It's got a beginning, a middle, it's got characters in it, it's got conflict, it's got resolution, it's got how-tos, and he trades those with his friends, So I look at that, and I think about when I started, and I was like, I got to save up money, does anybody know what a Bolex is? Anybody in the room? There used to be this thing called film, and you'd have a spring-wound camera, and it would roll for less than a minute or whatever, and it would hold 100 feet, and I think you get about 2 minutes of time on it. But you'd have to get the camera, you'd have to get the film, you have to get everybody out, you have to shoot it, then you get to process, then you have to edit it, then you have to get the projector, and you have to get everybody back again. My son sits down at the computer, and it's like, just starts telling the story and starts making it, right? So what happens with that generation when they're so used to making their own content? What does story look like? And so in some ways, when we're experimenting with stuff like Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things, we're looking and we're saying, okay, yes, story can be an innovation driver, but then also what does it really mean to collaboratively tell stories? And what does that mean in terms of intellectual property? And what does that mean in terms of the cultural barren landscape that we live in the United States, where I am from, where Walt Disney, for instance, they do an effective job of kicking copyright down the road, even though the base of a lot of their stuff is based on fairy tales, which are actually open. So they do a really good job of kind of locking things up, and a lot of things are locked up in intellectual property. So this project is very much about like, okay, let's unlock the code, let's unlock the narrative, and let's use Sherlock Holmes in an interesting way. And whether that comes out to be VR-based, AR-based, IoT, we're working this year and we're weaving in OpenAI into it. So we're doing some stuff where Watson is going to join Sherlock Holmes this coming fall, which is exciting. But really looking at some of those issues of what is it to not only tell stories with this technology, but how does humanity have a role in this as opposed to technology just shaping humanity? So what's exciting about the Digital Storytelling Lab where we are is that we don't care about market conditions. That's a rare thing to be able to say. But we don't really care about market conditions. We want to be able to experiment freely, and we want to be able to see what that yields, and we want to be able to openly share it, because there really is very little, if any, R&D within the entertainment industry. And if there is, it's locked up within, behind NDAs or behind patents. And so this idea of being able to have open libraries and ways in which people can kind of experiment with code and be able to help each other is quite exciting. If you're interested, I was talking before about, we had this Rotary Phone, and people could carry it around Lincoln Center, and the Rotary Phone had a Raspberry Pi in it, and it had a couple core features to it, all of which, if you're interested, the code is up there, and you can make use of it. One was it had a text-to-speech engine, right? So it could transfer any of its script to speech. It was cloud-enabled, so you could write to it from a distance, and it would ring. It was beacon-aware, so if we had a beacon field at Lincoln Center. There's about, I want to say, a couple hundred beacons all throughout those 13 acres. So when the phone would get near something, it would recognize that it was there, and it would ring. Right? So then all of a sudden somebody would start interacting with a character, a killer in a cat and mouse game or whatever somebody wanted to script to it. In addition to that, it was able to record audio, and it was able to play back media as well. But the core functionality of this is something that we're opening up for any of the objects that come in as we work to find a good protocol. Because one of the goals of the project is to create these massive connected crime scenes. What does that look like? How does that interact? That's something we're still experimenting with. But the idea is that we want these IoT objects to be something that stimulates creativity within a group of people. So if you go out and you start telling a story, then if you had a violin that was priceless and it was stolen, the interactions that you had within the field of play, when you got to tell your story, the violin would accompany you in some way that was relevant to the story that you had. Or there are certain things that we were doing with controlling lights through some of the objects. They get close to each other. They change the lighting in a particular space. They get close to a screen. They change what's on a screen. So it's this idea of kind of embracing ubiquitous computing, or this idea where it's calm technology. It's all about being in the peripheral, right? It's not necessarily about being buried in your device. And in fact, when we did have a device and we used it, it broke the flow because everybody became very interested in the screen. So what we're trying to do with this is say, can we use objects that are enchanted in some way, or smart objects that people can use as a way to tell a story? So it becomes about the human interaction and not necessarily solely about a screen interaction. And the other thing that's interesting about the project is there's no win scenario. We remove that. There's not one right way that a crime is solved or a crime is created. So it becomes very much a collaborative form of story and play. So as we go forward with the project, we have meetups that are going on all over the world. These are for two of the recent ones in New York. We're doing one on the 26th. It's about emotional technology and looking at the ways that we can bring emotion into the stories that we shape and the way in which we tell them. And I guess right now I want to say there's about 24 different cities that are running meetups all over the world. Anybody is welcome to do so if they want. I think, whoops, sorry. I want to jump over to my browser real quick here and show you a 404. Just kidding. This is the site for the Digital Storytelling Lab. You can find it at digitalstorytellinglab.com. And it has all kinds of the various projects that we've been working on. We're doing a lot around participatory urbanism and using storytelling as a way to explore the co-design of neighborhoods. This was a really fun project called Rikers Bot, which was about teaching coding to inmates at Rikers Island and doing it in a collaborative method. We've run innovation labs. We partnered with the city of Los Angeles and did a storytelling innovation lab with them that was really interesting over the last year or so. This project is really quite wonderful. It's called My Sky is Falling. Just really quickly, it was shaped with foster youth and my students at Columbia. What's interesting in the United States is every year about 30,000 kids age out of foster care every year, right? So they come out of the system. They either come out at 18 or 21. I think most states, all but 5 states are 18. And when they come out, they're on their own. And when I heard the stories of what happens to them, like 70% of them end up incarcerated, addicted to substances, pregnant, or homeless, it was heartbreaking. But then there were all these stories about identity theft and these stories about them being second-class citizens and all this crazy stuff that sounded like it was science fiction. And so I brought them in. I brought in some foster youth, and they worked with my students. And together they made this immersive experience that was a science fiction story, right? So it was all about design fiction. And what was really cool about it was we teamed up with MIT, and they gave us a bracelet that you could wear that would track your emotions as you went through the experience. And instead of relying on pre-survey and post-survey and audio-video transcription, we came up with 26 different feedback loops within the experience itself. There's a really cool white paper on it. If you're interested, you can find it at myskyisfalling.com. That's myskyisfalling.com. But what it pointed to, and like Sherlock and like that particular project, was this idea of how stories can start to be, the innovation that can come from them is pretty interesting, because that prototype for My Sky is Falling was made for a couple $100, and then the UN got word of it, and they invited us to run it at the UN, and now it's being adapted in 3 different states as a framework to train potential foster care parents and social workers to understand the emotional journey of a foster youth. Because when you go through the experience, what you come out on the other side realizing is everything you felt emotionally is what they feel every day when they age out. So this idea of evoking empathy is really interesting, and making use of technology to do so is something that we are very interested in doing at the Digital Storytelling Lab. If you're interested in Sherlock, as I mentioned, there's all kinds of really cool design documents up here and a lot of other interesting assets that's ongoing. This is sherlock.hackpad.com, and then this is just the site for the actual project. You can find it at sherlockholmes.io. So, when I look at this, what's really fascinating about the time that we live in is it's truly this amazing time to be a storyteller. And it's incredibly at odds with the reality of the attention economy. Like on one side, the tools have been radically democratized and commoditized, so it's easy to make something, but it's much harder to actually get it in front of people and to have them pay any attention to it. But on the other side of that is this fundamental thing that's radically shifting, which is this idea that a story maybe isn't just by one person anymore. It isn't just by an auteur, and the fact that you could break down that notion and you could allow people to step in and be co-collaborators or conspirators in this idea of shaping stories is something that's fascinating. But I think also looking and saying it doesn't just have to be something that's about entertainment. How can it be used in other ways? How can story be used in other ways? Because if you look at the rise of the commercial internet and you look at the first generation or 1.5 generation or even the second generation of social or mobile, most of those solutions have all been shaped by engineers or programmers. Now you have more of a rise of a creative technologist kind of class. You have people who are using story in more ways, story across a whole organization, from the back end to the front end and everything in between, and using narratives as a way to better create a common understanding. So I wonder what the future looks like as storytellers become more invested in this notion of shaping future solutions, and so maybe we won't necessarily be stuck in like a timeline that you have in certain services like Facebook or something. Like what's the next generation look like? And then what happens when there is no screen involved? What happens when it's just aware of what you're doing? I know that sounds kind of creepy, but let's just say that it's aware and it can be more reflective of your interests, your needs. It's funny, I did a project with David Cronenberg, which kind of is really on the horror side of this. It was called Body, Mind, Change, and it was kind of about this idea of a personal recommendation engine that you just put into the back of your neck through synaptic entanglement. That's a word we made up. It didn't exist. It would basically know everything you wanted, needed, and desired before you did. And so that story was all about the quantified self and about artificial intelligence and about this idea of emotional intelligence. But what is interesting is here, I'll just show you really quick. That's body-mind change. But what's interesting about the moment and the opportunity is that we can change the way that these stories are told. And what happens, just in the last moments that I have, I just want to paint a picture for you. I come from filmmaking, right? The work that I do has been incredibly devalued over the last decade or more. There's an incredible creative abuse structure that exists within the industry, right? The people who make the work are kind of in this rotating domestic abuse thing, like, oh, it's going to be better this time. I won't get screwed over this time. It's going to be okay this time. It's going to be better. And then on the other side of it is this whole thing of where what we make has been devalued to a certain extent, right? It's like it's freely accessible, which is wonderful, but it's very difficult to sustain. So a lot of really incredibly talented producers and directors and writers have found themselves at this threshold of where, wait, is this a profession or is this a hobby? You know, like, where do I go from here? What do I do? How do I sustain at this? And I think what's fascinating is, if you think about, just for a moment, this idea that in a project like Body, Mind, Change, we did it, where if you went through 3 simulations, you came out the other side, and it printed a physical object for you. We recorded, like, how long you watched, what you played, what you responded, and we ran it through an algorithm, and it would create your own pod. Right? So mine would be different than yours and yours and yours, and so it was this physical object where people flew in from different parts of the world to claim a little hunk of plastic that had been printed by a 3D printer. But if I take another step forward and I say, okay, well, what does that mean with IoT? And what does that mean in terms of this notion of breaking away from walled gardens that exist, like iTunes or your cable companies, or the way that you get content? And what if you helped, stepping into something like Sherlock Holmes, you created an object, and that object's connected to a network, so that object can send you media, right? You could build subscription models off of that. That object could change over time. It could change state. It could recognize other things around it, and it could change the way it interacted. It could do simple things like changing colors. It could change the lights when you walked into a room, whatever you wanted to do. But it just strikes me as interesting that maybe in some ways some of the challenges that I've seen within the entertainment industry could be answered in some regards with this idea of allowing those formerly known as the audience to be collaborators in a creative process that allows them to create something or co-create something that they care about, that can evolve over time. And with that, new models can evolve and new business models can come from it. So then, hopefully, as we move forward, there'll be an opportunity to do it in an ethical way, to do it in a way that embraces and recognizes the creative work that went into it, but then also ways that break from permission-based culture. So you don't have to spend years trying to convince somebody that you want to make something. You can just make it. So thank you very much.